Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 13, Section 5, The Rise of Segregation. Roman numeral number 1, Resistance and Repression. Benjamin Pap Singleton, who you see pictured below in the bottom left-hand corner, organized a mass migration of African Americans from the rural South to the state of Kansas. His community that he established was called Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is roughly due south of the community of McCook, Nebraska, which is in the southwest corner of our state. And not only would you find communities very similar to Nicodemus in Kansas, but if you crossed into Nebraska and in Custer County, and to kind of give you a perspective, the county seat in Custer County is Broken Bow. But in that vicinity and then on up into Cherry County, which is where Valentine, Nebraska is located, you would also find communities that were established by African Americans who had moved west to take advantage of things like the Homestead Act. In letter B, many African American farmers joined the Populist Party when it was formed in 1891. But in letter C, Democratic leaders warned that populism would return the South to Black republicanism rule, similar to that of the Reconstruction. So, there's a certain divide here. Granted, African Americans probably looked upon populism as a way to kind of gain a little bit of support politically. But at the same time, there were those that were out there that were kind of leery of it. In Roman numeral 2, imposing segregation, a movement to diminish the civil rights of African Americans gained momentum at the end of the 19th century. And in letter B, there were two methods in the state of Mississippi that were used to deny the vote to African Americans. The first was something known as a poll tax. Pictured below here in the left-hand corner is an example of a receipt here for a poll tax, but it is a fee that a person would pay to go and cast a ballot. And you would pay that when you went to the polls to vote. And if you could not afford whatever the tax was, and for example, this one was from 1918 and the poll tax was $1, then obviously you would be denied that right to vote. The other was something known as a literacy test. A literacy test was kind of a reading test that was given by some kind of election commissioner or some election official. And what you would do is you would go and you would most likely probably go to your local courthouse. There would be some clerks there. And if you wanted to vote, you had to read a certain passage and then be able to interpret the meaning of that. And in the state of Mississippi, quite often they were using passages from the Mississippi State Constitution. Truth is, many of the people who were working in those election offices probably couldn't even read and interpret the meaning of the literacy test that they were actually administrating. So it really was kind of a biased way to deny African Americans that right to vote. In letter C, sometimes you would find a grandfather clause, which was introduced in order to exempt whites from voting restrictions such as a literacy test. And what this would basically mean is if you were white, but let's say you were illiterate, meaning that you could not read, if your grandpa had been able to vote in a previous election, then his voting record would be enough to allow, a current person who was wanting to vote but not being able to pass the literacy test, that opportunity to cast a ballot. Letter D, the statuses or statutes enforcing segregation were known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were a lot like the Black Codes. And these were laws that were kind of named after a minstrel who kind of was making the opera house circuits kind of in the era after the Civil War. Typically, Jim Crow, the character was a white man that wore blackface, which would today be considered to be pretty rude and very racist. But these laws were very similar to the black codes. So, for example, if there was a gathering of African Americans in some black codes or some Jim Crow laws, they might require a white person to be present. Another example would possibly be if a person was walking down the street, an African American person, and a white person was on the sidewalk, it would be assumed that the black person would get off the sidewalk and allow the white person to pass. If you were an African American woman and somebody started talking to you, be it a man or a woman, you would say, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. You would never give them direct eye contact. Same goes for an African American male. You would direct your conversation always saying, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. Again, never giving direct eye contact. So Jim Crow laws, for the most part, certainly really restricted the lives of African Americans. And not only did you see them in the South, but you pretty much saw them throughout the United States, even in the North. In letter E, in 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that private businesses such as hotels, theaters, and also railroads were free to practice segregation. And certainly that made some people very upset. And eventually there's going to be a challenge, of course. And it comes from a guy named Homer Plessy, who you see pictured below in the bottom right-hand corner. Homer Plessy was a railroad worker in the state of Louisiana. And some people might label him as a mulatto, meaning that he was half black, half white. There were many occasions that Homer Plessy was said to have passed as a white man, but those who knew him knew kind of his background, and they knew he was kind of tied to the black community. So needless to say, one day he had obtained a pass to ride on the railroad, which he had worked for, and he used that pass. But he was a little fed up with some of these segregation laws, and he chose to ride in the passenger car for white passengers only. And somebody from the railroad recognized Homer, and they got mad. And needless to say, they threatened to throw him off. And obviously, he fought back, and we have a lawsuit. So eventually, this case goes before the United States Supreme Court, roughly in 1896, and the ruling in Homer versus Plessy, Plessy versus Ferguson, really established the legal basis for discrimination in the South. It was considered to be one of the worst decisions of the United States Supreme Court, and what it basically said is that you can have separate facilities. In other words, you can segregate as long as it is equal. Hence, we get the saying separate but equal. And this becomes the policy from literally the late 1890s up until the 1950s, about 1954, when we have the case of Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So unfortunately, Homer's hard-fought battle really doesn't necessarily bring about a lot of change, but it certainly brings attention to the cause. In Roman numeral 3, African American response. In 1895, a book published by Ida B. Wells, who you see pictured below, denounced mob violence and demanded a fair trial by law for those accused of a crime. Just so you know a little bit about Ida B. Wells, she was an investigative reporter. She had lived in Memphis, Tennessee for many years, well-educated, very articulate, and she was getting fed up with all the crimes that were being basically levied against African Americans. Matter of fact, there had been a little retail area in her neighborhood that at one point in time is kind of like ransacked by whites. And unfortunately, there were African Americans that were denied compensation and in some cases accused of starting the whole thing themselves. Ida B. Wells wrote about it. And matter of fact, she encouraged a group of friends to pack up and to leave Memphis, Tennessee, and to head north to Chicago. And it's in Chicago she really makes a name for herself as a writer and basically an individual who is going to be outright vocal about the nonsense of segregation. She was definitely ahead of her times and probably is underrated for her contributions to American history. In letter B, in an address known as the Atlanta Compromise, Booker T. Washington urged African Americans to concentrate on preparing themselves educationally and vocationally for full equity or equality. Booker T. Washington was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. He had been probably one of the more touted African Americans when we talk about our members of Congress and even in members of the White House. It is documented that at one point in time when Theodore Roosevelt is president, that he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House to dine, and it was Booker T. Washington was the first African American man to be given that honor. If you looked at Washington, there are many African Americans who live in that community and work in that community, but for years they had basically been treated as under class citizens. So he comes out and publicly says this, but he is challenged publicly. And in letter C, Washington's views were challenged by a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois, who you see pictured below. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founders of the NAACP. And the NAACP for years has been advocating for civil rights for African Americans. And he was particularly concerned with protecting and exercising voting rights. He wanted to make sure that African Americans had the right to suffrage, meaning that they weren't forced to pay a poll tax or forced to be administered a literacy test, that wherever they went, they would be able to vote without being challenged. And at times, these two men would butt heads. Matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois later in life is so fed up with the system here in the United States that he actually leaves for the continent of Africa. And that is where he will die. Thank you very much.